All right. Welcome, everyone, to our next unit, which will be about, well, as you can tell from the title screen, Shakespeare and maybe his most famous play, one of his most famous plays, Romeo and Juliet. I think the timing works quite well, actually, with Valentine's Day coming up. Romeo and Juliet is understood, I would argue, commonly misunderstood story, where it's seen in pop culture as this cliched, perfect love story, when in fact, more than anything, Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy, and perhaps even an anti-love story. These are all things that we will explore, discuss, and talk about together. But for now, today, I just want to give you guys a little bit of background about Shakespeare himself, about the world that he lived in, his influences, and then a few things concerning the play, themes in the play, important characters, what we should know about them before we start. And I guess the main thing is I don't want you guys to be intimidated when we actually start reading the Shakespeare in class, because the language is old and it can be confusing at first, but we do have some tips and strategies to help you with that. We'll be reading a lot of this out loud in class, acting it out, working through it together, and therefore I think you guys will really enjoy this. So without further ado, please make sure you take notes on this, as just like with the Odyssey, there will be a quiz on this information, and just like the Odyssey, you may or may not, most likely may, definitely may, be allowed to use your notes on that quiz. So take notes, handwritten, no screenshots, and make sure that they're thorough. All right. Okay, so some important background information you should know about Renaissance drama. And this is the time period we're talking about with Shakespeare, the Renaissance. So approximately, in terms of drama, 1500s into the 1600s, late 1500s, mid 1600s. That's the historical time period that we're working in here, the Renaissance. But before Renaissance drama came around, there was medieval drama. And as you know from history, the medieval period preceded the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth, out of the Middle Ages, out of the medieval period. So there are some big changes going on in society and culture that are well, we will talk about in this presentation. But as far as medieval drama goes, so before Shakespeare, before the Renaissance, there were really three, and we call them the three M's. There were three kinds of plots in drama. So when people went to go see plays in the Middle Ages, this is what they were seeing. Okay? And I use plots loosely because a lot of times we did not have these well-rounded characters, and we did not have, rising action and climax and resolution, all the things we think about when we think about plot. They didn't quite have those. They were more concepts than plots. So the first is the mystery plot, which is also known as cycles, which are stories just directly from the Bible. The second of the three M's were miracles, or miracle plays, which were stories about the lives of the saints. And then third M were morality plays. And these were very simple, didactic stories about good versus evil. You might have a character named Everyman who goes down a path, who travels down a path through the woods of temptation. And it was symbolic, but everything was a very direct symbol, and there wasn't too much subtlety to it. These were all three of these were very simple productions. However, they also featured a lot of violence and a lot of gore, and sometimes even torture. If you know stories about the saints, or even stories from the Old Testament and New Testament for that matter in the Bible, a lot of them are quite violent. And in the Middle Ages, they had no problem bringing that violence on stage. In fact, that might be one of the main reasons people flocked to see these things. It's because of how violent they were. Okay, so here are a couple of images from the medieval period in the world of drama. On the left-hand side, you see characterizations of some of these figures from the morality plays. There's a character, Everyman, on the left there, and then you might have a character named Death, who, not too creatively, would symbolize death and maybe try to come after every man who has to make sure that he's in a morally good place before death comes to him. And then if you look on the right-hand side, this is a town square, a medieval town square. And as you can see, the acting troupe, the medieval acting troupe, would set up in the middle of the square, and then they'd put the stage up. They'd travel from town to town, so there wasn't really a permanent theater. And then people would hear about the performance going on and would flock into the town square and kind of surround it on all sides like that, which is an interesting setup, not too effective for actually following the plot and the dialogue. But again, in the Middle Ages, that wasn't so important, as it would later become, which we'll see in a second. Okay, so in addition to the 3 M's, the morality plays and the miracles and the mysteries going on, over in the universities in the Middle Ages, there's a lot of classical drama being performed. And by classical drama, I mean these are plays that were written during the ancient Greek and ancient Roman time periods. Some of the big names are Sophocles and Euripides. And by the way, there is a class at Haddonfield that's all about Greek drama. You can take it when you're a senior, and it's really, really cool. You read some pretty crazy stuff, just an FYI. Anyway, these classical plays are in some ways the opposite of those 3M, those religious plays that were being performed, because these classical dramas, and again, they're being performed just in the university, so they have a very small audience as opposed to the other, to the 3M type plays. They have very complex plots, interesting characters with backstories and motivations, and they also don't feature any violence on stage whatsoever. Violent things happen in these plays, but they always happen off stage. So again, the 3M plays, not very much plot, not very much in terms of character development, but very violent. The classical dramas that are being performed in the universities, very different. And there is a huge dichotomy between universities and the common life of the everyday person in this time period. Universities were walled off from the rest of society. You had to be very wealthy in order to go there. So very, very different from today. Okay, so finally, right before Shakespeare's time, a guy comes along. His name is Thomas Kyd, and he has a brilliant idea. And his idea is to take the plot and character development from those classical plays, those classical type plays that are being performed in the schools, and combine them with the violence and the action of the religious plays, those mystery, the miracle, and the morality plays. So that's exactly what he does. And he writes this play. It's a huge hit. It changes the course of drama forever, really. So he writes this play called The Spanish Tragedy. And again, it combines what made both sides of drama popular, combines them into one. And people go crazy for this thing. It's a revenge tragedy, which means, the main character, their best friend or lover gets murdered, and they spend the rest of the play trying to get revenge. It's entertaining. It's written in an iambic pentameter, something we'll talk about later, but it's a verse form that becomes really standard in the Renaissance. Shakespeare writes almost exclusively in his plays. So the main thing to know about Thomas Kyd is that he combines the classical drama with the morality plays, the miracle, the mystery plays, creates a huge hit with The Spanish Tragedy. And this ends up being an influence on everyone, but of course, Shakespeare in particular. As far as acting goes, there wasn't necessarily, like, up until Shakespeare's time, there wasn't necessarily you couldn't really be a professional actor, so to speak. Um, if you were a lower class man, who didn't have much of a future or any job opportunities, you for a long time you could just be forced into the military. So these masterless men, they didn't have a job, they didn't have a boss, they didn't work for anyone. They would go to wealthy, usually nobility, and say, "Hey, look, if you protect us from being forced into the military, we will act for you, and you can turn us into an acting troupe, and we will act for your friends, and we'll entertain you, and we can play at your parties. We don't really need to be paid, we just want to get protected from being forced into the military," which at the time was not a great option. So this idea of having a patron does carry over into Shakespeare's time, although by the time Shakespeare arrives in London and starts writing plays, there are professional actors, professional writers, or professional playwrights, but this idea of still being sponsored by a wealthy patron, that still existed. And his acting troupe, the guys that he worked with, they were Lord Chamberlain's men. Eventually they become the King's men because, not surprisingly, Shakespeare's troupe becomes hugely popular, and so much so that King James eventually decides to pick them up for his own, as sort of a sign of being prestigious. And when I do say guys, I do mean that literally, because unfortunately women were not allowed on the stage during Shakespeare's time. So all the female characters were played by men at the time. So a little bit about Shakespeare himself. We think his birthday is April 23rd, 1564. We're not entirely sure on that date, but it's our best guess. He was born in a small town. It's called Stratford-on-Avon. You can go visit it today. You can see a recreation of his childhood home. I don't know how accurate it is, but it's still worth checking out. His family is very middle class. Shakespeare never got a college education. Our best guess is that he learned about the theater from his dad. His dad was not an actor, but his dad was a government official, and we think that his job in the local government was to sort of preview any of the traveling plays that were going around from town to town to see if they were suitable for the local community. So there's a good chance that young William Shakespeare sort of tagged along with his dad and got a chance to watch these performances that were being sort of tested for the market. So that's one theory as to how Shakespeare became interested in the theater. He married a woman named Anne Hathaway in 1582, and when I talk about Anne Hathaway, I of course mean the original Anne Hathaway, not the potentially irritating and overrated Anne Hathaway from Les Mis and The Devil Wears Prada, who you may or may not like. She seems divisive. A lot of people hate her. But we're not talking about her. We're talking about the original Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife. There was a bit of an age difference there, something to keep in mind. So not a huge difference. She was 26. He was 18 when they married. So she's a little bit of a cougar. No, maybe not a cougar, but definitely at least a lynx or a bobcat. So age difference, Anne Hathaway marries Shakespeare in 1582. They end up having 3 children, although it's Susanna, Judith, and Hamnet, although his son Hamnet does pass away in childhood. And the name of that child could have inspired his play Hamlet. There are theories about that, which seem to make sense. Sometime between 1585 and 1592, I know that's a big gap, he does move to London, where he, not immediately, but eventually becomes a pretty famous playwright and actor. In this time, plays were written not by an individual author oftentimes. There are some exceptions to that. Shakespeare was an exception. He always acted in his own plays as well. Plays would run for no more usually than 1 to 2 weeks. So if you think about if you go to see a movie that opened over the holidays, it might be in a decent number of theaters, probably not as many as when it opened 6 weeks ago, but it's there's still a pretty quick turnover. But back then it was an even quicker turnover. If you didn't get to see Romeo and Juliet for the 2 weeks that it ran, you were kind of out of luck. But there was such a demand for new plays that there was a high turnover. So every 1 to 2 weeks there was a new play being performed. This is a generalization, but some people think that Shakespeare wrote his best comedies at a younger age and then his best tragedies later, although Romeo and Juliet came early, and that's a pretty good tragedy. So, just something to think about. A little bit more about Shakespeare. So when he arrived in London and started writing, people didn't really like him. He actually got some bad reviews. Another playwright named Robert Greene called him, and this is an exact quotation, "He was an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers." So they thought he was not a good writer. Didn't write well. Maybe his language was ugly, and he stole things from other people. So not a huge fan club for Shakespeare when he first moves to London. Poor guy. Some of it had to do with the fact that he was not college educated, that he came from this very middle class background. He bought his own coat of arms because he didn't inherit one from his family, which was common for people moving up in society, moving up the rungs of the social ladder. But again, shows that he came from a more modest background. In 1599, the Globe Theatre is built, which is a little bit after Romeo and Juliet, but it's still worth talking about because that's where many of Shakespeare's plays were acted, and it's such a cool place that I want to show it to you. In 1603, Elizabeth I dies, which causes a major shift in English history. There's a lot of anxiety about what the future is going to hold. 1609, Shakespeare's sonnets are published. We're actually going to look at a sonnet because Romeo and Juliet is kind of unique in that it starts with this little epilogue, which is in the form of a sonnet. So that'll be the first thing we look at. In 1610, he leaves London, goes back to his hometown, and dies 6 years later. It seems most likely, if we're right about the day he was born, on the same day, April 23rd. And then his plays, the first group of his plays were published in 1623, which might seem weird to you that they weren't published earlier, but typically these plays that were performed at the Globe were not published. People just went to go see them, and no one really recorded the plays and saved them. So a lot of these plays were recorded secondhand or by the actors who were in them who remembered the lines. So, kind of interesting that when we read these Shakespearean plays that, a lot of times these weren't coming directly from him. They were sort of secondhand, whisper down the lane type scenario. Here's a little depiction of what the Globe Theatre looked like. And if you go to London today, you can visit the recreation and watch a Shakespearean play there. It's very, very cool, actually. We'll be showing you at least some clips of a performance of Romeo and Juliet that was filmed at the Globe, so you can see what that looks like. So, as I mentioned before, the demand for these plays was extremely high. So the Globe was built to sort of meet that growing demand and that growing popularity. So you can tell that it's very, very different. Remember that picture I showed you in the first couple slides of that stage set up in the middle of the town square in the medieval period? Well, things have changed quite a bit. This is permanent. It's big. It's relatively big. It can sit a lot of people. And it's, there's, well, I'll get into more details in a second. As you can see, the stage is elevated. It's about 5.5 feet for a couple of reasons. There were some trapdoors on the stage for, very rudimentary special effects, people popping out, disappearing. And also, there's a group of lower class people who'd go see the plays. They couldn't afford the seats. As you can see, these seats all around the edges of the theater. So they would stand right in front of the stage. It would be just like a giant mosh pit right there in front of the stage. They were called the groundlings. They were lower class. Oftentimes they would show up a little bit drunk to the performances. They'd be a little rowdy. Sometimes fights would break out. Shakespeare actually knew that a lot of times these groundlings were loud and would show up late and kind of disrupt the play. So he made sure not to put too many important details in the first couple scenes, because he knew people were settling in, the groundlings were being loud and kind of annoying. Well, I'll talk more about them in a couple minutes. There were very few props during the performances. They would not try to recreate the costumes from that time period when the play took place. They would be, they would just be, of 1600 or 1595. They wouldn't try to recreate costumes from Italy from 1300s, and that didn't really bother anyone. They weren't going for accuracy necessarily. And there was a canopy built across the stage. If they wanted to recreate the night sky, they could pull that across if the performance calls for it. All right, moving on to the last couple slides here. Hang in there with me. These are about the play itself, about Romeo and Juliet. You may or may not know the premise, but most likely you do. It's about two families in Verona, Italy, that absolutely despise each other. They've been fighting for a long time, getting revenge on each other, perpetuating the cycle of violence. However, the son from one family and the daughter of the other, unknowingly, they don't know when they fall in love that they're from these opposite families, but then they eventually realize it and have to deal with the consequences. So as I said, the story takes place in Verona, Italy, in the 1300s, so a couple hundred years before Shakespeare's time. And without getting into too much detail about it, the main thing to know is that Italy, during the 1300s, and for quite a bit after that and before that, was kind of a chaotic place. There was really no unified Italy like we know it today. There were a bunch of these little city-states, cities all over the place that operated as their own countries. They were constantly fighting with each other. Some of the states supported the Pope. Some of the states supported the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. They'd fight amongst themselves. And then to make things even worse, there were families within these city-states that were fighting for control of the city-states. And that's where we step into with Romeo and Juliet. Two powerful families, the Montagues and the Capulets, fighting with each other, despising each other, and again, that's where we step into the play. It was written early in Shakespeare's career, around 1595. Something that you may or may not know about Shakespeare is that he did not invent these characters. He did not invent this plot. Both of those had been around for a long time. The story of Romeo and Juliet actually comes from ancient Greece, and it had been rewritten. I wouldn't be surprised if it had been rewritten a dozen times. Shakespeare copied the idea essentially directly from the story. You can see the spelling there. The tragical history of Romeus and Juliet from Arthur Brooke. I'm sorry, and he changes things. He fleshes out the characters, but the basic plot wasn't his, and that's the case for a lot of his plays, believe it or not. Okay, just real quick, some of the important characters. Like I said, we have these two families that are fighting. The one family are the Montagues. In the play, you'll see Montague and Lady Montague. They're the parents, they're the heads of the family. Their son is Romeo. The first time we see Romeo, he's going to be talking about how much he loves this girl named Rosaline. That changes pretty quickly, as you can imagine, which we'll get into. We'll talk about what's going on there. And then another important character in the Montague family is Romeo's cousin named Benvolio. He's on stage a lot with Romeo. He's there helping him out as much as possible. Sorry for the typo there. That should, of course, be Romeo, not Rome. And then we have the Capulet family. They're the family that the Montagues are feuding with. Capulet and Lady Capulet, heads of the family. There's a really interesting scene where Capulet has a chance to get to fight and enact some violence on the Montagues and decides not to. You might get the sense that they're getting a little fatigued of the constant fighting and the constant violence, but we'll look at that in more detail in the play. Juliet is their only daughter, so that's important. So when she falls in love with a Montague, that could present some problems. And then we have this character, Tybalt, who is Juliet's cousin, and he is perpetually angry. He's trying to pick fights with Montagues. And, we'll see what happens with that at a certain point in the play. Some other important characters, Aeschylus, he's the Prince of Verona, and this poor guy, he is just trying to bring the city together. He's trying to create peace. He's trying to create a stable society in Verona, and instead he has to deal with these two crazy families that are constantly butting heads and fighting. So he's got his work cut out for him. Aeschylus has a couple of relatives who are important. They say that they're kinsmen, so I don't know if that means cousins. I think it's fair to assume that there's something like that, first cousins or second cousins. Paris is an important relative of Aeschylus. He really wants to marry Juliet, and we'll see what happens there, of course. Mercutio. I put his name in all caps because he has a lot of stage time and is, in my opinion, maybe the most entertaining character. He's constantly making fun of Romeo. He's constantly telling jokes. He's telling a lot of inappropriate jokes, like sex jokes and jokes about penises, which, by the way, the groundlings, remember them? The guys all up at the beginning of the stage who were at the front of the stage who were drunk. They loved those jokes. They loved Mercutio. He's a great character, and he brings so much life to the drama. Like, if you ever feel like, oh my god, I'm so tired of Romeo and Juliet talking about how much they love each other, Mercutio comes in and it just brings you right back into it. And then finally we have this priest named Friar Lawrence. Interesting guy. He does some things that sort of move the Romeo and Juliet's relationship along quite quickly, but he also is trying to give them some wisdom about, well, maybe don't rush into it, take it easy. It's complicated. Okay, and then last couple things here, some important terms to know. Maybe you've seen these before, I'm not sure. A soliloquy is when we have an actor in a Shakespeare play on stage by themselves, speaking out loud, and it seems a little awkward, but this is really the only way that the playwright can give us an insight right into the mind of the character so then we know what they're thinking, right? I mean, this isn't a novel. It's not Catcher in the Rye where we can see, oh, this is what Holden's thinking. You can't do that on stage, and it's not a movie, so we don't have voiceovers. So a soliloquy is a chance to see inside the mind of the character. So they'll be on stage, usually, by themselves. There'll be a light shining on them, and we know that, okay, this is what the character's thinking, but they have to say it because, well, otherwise, how would we know? An aside is like a really short soliloquy. There'll be other characters on stage within earshot, but they'll set it up so that it's obvious, okay, this is a character just saying something to themselves or thinking something to themselves. No one else on stage can hear it. It's not a long soliloquy. It's just a little here is what Romeo's thinking. He's saying this. No one else actually hears it. We'll see both of those things in the play. And then finally, some important themes. These are some concepts we'll be discussing as we read through this play. Is this a love story? What is the difference between love and obsession or infatuation or objectification? And then do these characters actually love each other? Okay, it's so important for understanding the play. There's this idea of fate. Do we control everything that happens in our lives? Is it predetermined? Is it somewhere in between? There are a lot of references to astrology. The way the planets are aligned and the stars sort of determines what's going to happen, which was a popular Renaissance belief. How much does a name actually mean, right? You have these two families that hate each other, and at a certain point it's based purely on just, well, one person has a different name, the other person has another. What does that really mean about what's beneath the surface? How important is a name to the actual substance of something, to the actual substance of a human being? And then finally, revenge and the way that it just perpetuates the cycle of violence. We'll see this constantly as the two families the tensions rise, violence breaks out. And then more violence breaks out because of that. All right, so that is it for this epic, life-changing video. I hope it did change your life, and I hope you did take notes, again, because there will be a quiz, and you will most likely, and by most likely I mean you will definitely be able to use your notes on that quiz, so make sure you did a good job with that, and I will see you in class. Take care.